I inherited my grandfather's cabin 3 weeks after they found me sobbing in my car outside the funeral home, unable to drive away, unable to let go. The lawyer handed me a key wrapped in old leather and an address I barely remembered, a place tucked deep into the Pacific Northwest Mountains where I'd spent childhood summers that felt more like viva dreams than memories. He told me the property had sat empty for 15 years since my grandfather's death, waiting. I didn't understand why it had taken so long to reach me, but grief doesn't ask for explanations, and I needed somewhere to disappear. The drive up felt like descending into another world, each mile pulling me further from the life I'd been failing to live. Towering pines closed in around the gravel road, their shadows swallowing the afternoon light, until I could barely tell if I was moving forward or backward through time. The air grew thick with moss and memory, and my hands trembled on the wheel, not from fear, but from something I couldn't name. When the cabin finally appeared through the mist, it looked smaller than I remembered, humbled by the forest that had begun reclaiming it. I stepped out into silence so complete it felt intentional, like the woods were holding their breath. The windows were fogged and streaked, but through them I saw darkness that seemed to watch back. Something about this place remembered me, and I wasn't sure if that should bring comfort or warning. The cabin door resisted at first, swollen from years of rain and neglect, then gave way with a groan that echoed too long into the trees behind me. Inside, dust hung in the air like suspended time, and everything sat exactly as memory insisted it should. The stone fireplace, the wooden table, the rocking chair still angled toward the window, but something felt wrong, rearranged in ways I couldn't articulate, as if someone had studied photographs of this place and recreated it just slightly off. I moved through the rooms, touching nothing, aware suddenly that I was not discovering, but being observed, evaluated, measured, against some standard I didn't understand. The windows stopped me cold. Handprints covered the glass from outside, massive and deliberate, pressed against the panes like something, had stood in the darkness cupping their face to peer in. I traced one with my finger, my own hand dwarfed within its outline, and my breath caught when I realized these weren't smudged or accidental. They were careful, almost gentle, the prints of fingers that had pressed without breaking, watched without entering. How many nights had they stood here? How many years? Outside, the forest had consumed the clearing I remembered, pressing close enough to scrape the roof. The garden my grandfather tended had become a wild tangle, but within it I found strange pathways, deliberate gaps between the undergrowth that circled the cabin like arteries. I followed one until it disappeared into shadow, and that's when I felt it. The weight of attention from the tree line, patient and unwavering. Not the scattered watchfulness of animals, but something, focused, something that knew exactly what I was and had been waiting for me to arrive. I turned back to the cabin as twilight bled between the branches, and every window reflected not my own face, but the darkness of the forest behind me. The boundaries between inside and outside felt suddenly porous, meaningless, as if this place existed in negotiation with what surrounded it. My grandfather hadn't just lived here, he'd been permitted to live here, and I was beginning to understand that permission might not automatically extend to me. I didn't sleep that first night, I endured it. The breathing started just after midnight, deep and rhythmic, circling the cabin's perimeter with footfalls that made the floorboards tremble beneath my grandfather's old cot. I lay frozen, listening to something massive move, with impossible quiet between each thunderous step, pausing at every window as if conducting an inspection. When silence finally returned near dawn, it felt less like departure and more like withdrawal, a conscious choice. To grant me temporary reprieve, morning light gave me courage I hadn't earned, and I began exploring the back rooms I'd avoided as a child, storage spaces my grandfather kept locked and unmentioned. The first door opened onto what should have been chaos, but was instead cathedral-like in its arrangement, stones stacked in careful spirals, feathers, bundled with dried grass and hung from ceiling beams in descending sizes. Bones, deer, elk, something larger, laid out in patterns that suggested language or ritual, meaning rendered in calcium and shadow. I knelt before the largest arrangement, a mandala of river rocks circling a sun-bleached skull, and understood with sudden clarity that my grandfather hadn't lived here alone. This wasn't decoration or eccentricity. This was dialogue, exchange, evidence of decades spent in conversation without words. The dust on the floor showed recent disturbance, trails where something had entered and carefully maintained what he'd begun, keeping the shrine alive even after his death. My hands trembled as I touched nothing, rearranged nothing, recognizing finally that I hadn't inherited a cabin but a covenant, and these rooms were proof that both parties had been keeping their promises long after one of them was gone. I found his journal wedged behind a loose stone in the fireplace, leather cracked like dried riverbeds, pages brittle, with confessions never meant for town ears. His handwriting shook in the early entries, fear turning ink to frantic slashes, but steadied over years into something like reverence. He called them his silent neighbors, described their first tentative exchanges, venison left on the tree line, returned with arrangements of perfect pine cones. What began as appeasement became ritual, ritual became relationship, and relationship became something bordering on kinship across an unbridgeable divide. The pact revealed itself in careful detail. He would leave offerings at each new moon, never bring firearms beyond the clearing, turn away hunters with fabricated warnings of unstable ground. In return, they kept the forest free of poachers, drove off developers with inexplicable equipment failures, and surveyor reports of unsettling wildlife activity. My grandfather had become mediator between worlds, guardian of a secret that predated roads and property lines, protecting those who could never petition for protection themselves. One entry stopped my breath. They understand legacy. Today, the matriarch brought her youngest to the ridge at dawn. Let me see the child clearly, teaching it my face, my scent, ensuring continuity. He'd known he was dying, had written my name in the margins beside sketches of their territories, mapping the inheritance he couldn't explain in any will. I closed the journal as understanding settled like snow. He hadn't left me property but purpose, a calling that chose its keepers across generations. Dawn came apologetic through mist when I saw them. 4 silhouettes against the ridge where granite met sky, impossibly tall and utterly still. The largest stood center, easily 8 feet of coiled power. Draped in fur so dark it swallowed light, flanked by what could only be family. My breath crystallized between us as the smallest one shifted, and I understood with shocking clarity that I was being evaluated, measured against my grandfather's memory, by eyes that held no animal emptiness. The matriarch moved first, one deliberate step forward that sent my pulse hammering against reason. She wasn't threatening but testing, watching how I held my ground, or whether I'd run screaming back to civilization's comfort. My grandfather's words echoed, "They understand legacy," and I forced myself motionless, despite every instinct screaming retreat. This wasn't chance encounter, but formal introduction. Threshold I could cross or abandon forever. The young one made a sound, something between grunt and question, and the father's massive hand settled on its shoulder with heartbreaking gentleness. That gesture broke something in me. The mythology crumbled into beings who loved, who taught their children caution, who mourned losses and remembered kindnesses across decades. They weren't monsters tolerating human proximity, but a family choosing trust despite 1,000 reasons for hatred. They turned as one, melting back into forest shadow, but the father paused, glancing back with an expression I couldn't name. It felt like both warning and invitation. "Your move now, inheritor." I started, with apples and dried venison on the porch at dusk, my hands trembling as I arranged them on the flat stone I'd dragged from the creek. The ritual felt absurd in daylight's memory, but under the weight of watching forest, it became sacrament, an inheritance I was finally claiming. My grandfather's journal had been specific about placement and timing, about the language of respect that required no words. I lit the small candle he'd described, its flame a beacon that said, "I see you, I remember, I choose this." 3 nights passed before they accepted, and I woke to find the food gone and something left behind. A piece of driftwood carved into spirals that hurt to look at directly. Patterns that seemed to shift when I blinked. More followed. Riverstones stacked in impossible balance. Bundles of plants I later identified as yarrow and devil's club. A raven's feather threaded through with sinew. Each gift felt like vocabulary in a conversation spanning species, a slow negotiation of boundaries and intentions that my grandfather had spent decades learning. On the 7th night, I heard footsteps approach closer than before, stopping just beyond the porch light's reach. The matriarch stood at the tree line, her child partially hidden behind her leg, both watching me through the window with eyes that reflected gold. I pressed my palm against the glass, and after an eternal moment, she mirrored the gesture, her massive hand dwarfing mine, separated only by fragile barrier and centuries of fear. When she withdrew, I found tiny handprints in the dust beside hers and understood they were teaching their young to trust me, passing forward the pact as I had inherited it. I found the youngest one at dawn, its leg twisted in. Steel jaws near the southern property line where hunters had been trespassing. The creature's whimpers cut through morning mist like broken glass, and when our eyes met, I saw the same terror I'd felt watching my grandfather die, helpless, betrayed by the world's cruelty. The father emerged from the brush behind me, close enough that I felt his breath on my neck, smelled earth and pine and something ancient. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I knelt beside his child instead, reaching for the trap's release mechanism. The metal was slick with morning dew and rust, fighting my grip as the young one trembled. The father's shadow engulfed us both, his breathing heavy and deliberate, and I understood this was the moment the pact would either hold or shatter. My grandfather's words echoed from his journal. They remember kindness, but they never forget betrayal. I pulled the jaws apart with strength born from desperation, and the creature stumbled free, limping immediately to its father's side. They didn't flee. The father stepped forward instead, lowering his massive head until we were level, his eyes searching mine with an intelligence that made my throat tighten. In that gaze, I saw judgment, calculation, and something that looked impossibly like gratitude. He touched his child's shoulder, then looked back at me, and I felt the weight of being truly seen, not as human or threat, but as individual, as chosen. When they disappeared into the trees, I found my hands shaking so hard I couldn't stand. That night, I sat on the porch, unable to sleep, replaying the forest encounter until it felt like a fever dream. The moon hung full and low, turning the clearing silver, and that's when I heard it, a single set of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. The father emerged from the darkness alone, larger than I'd realized, his silhouette blocking out the stars. He stopped at the porch edge, and for a breathless moment, we simply existed in each other's presence. He lowered himself to one knee with surprising grace, and the gesture felt ceremonial, weighted with meaning I was only beginning to comprehend. His eyes found mine with an intensity that stripped away every defense, every rational thought, until I felt transparent before him. This was no animal. This was a being offering recognition, bridging a chasm between our worlds, with a choice that felt both terrifying and sacred. My grandfather had earned this trust over decades, and somehow, impossibly, it was being extended to me. From somewhere in his fur, he produced a leather cord, and my breath caught. The pendant swinging from it was my grandfather's, the one he'd worn every day, the one we'd buried him without because we couldn't find it. The father placed it carefully, at my feet, and the message was unmistakable. Your blood understood, and now you must carry what he carried. When he stood and turned back to the forest, I pressed my grandfather's pendant against my chest and wept. The weight of inheritance had never felt so holy, so utterly inescapable, so completely mine to bear. They came on a Thursday morning, with clipboards and machinery, men in pressed shirts who saw only timber value and resort potential. The lead developer spread blueprints across my porch railing, pointing to where luxury cabins would replace ancient trees, where a spa would erase the ridge where the family watched and waited. He quoted numbers that would solve every financial problem I'd ever had, his smile practiced and empty. I felt the pendant burning against my chest beneath my shirt, my grandfather's silent question echoing through my blood. That afternoon I walked the property line, seeing it as they did, valuable, exploitable, undefended. But I also saw the carefully placed stones marking boundaries, the trees, bent in patterns that meant sanctuary, the generations of trust woven into this soil. My grandfather hadn't left me property. He'd left me a lineage, a sacred duty that transcended ownership. The choice crystallized with painful clarity. I could walk away wealthy and hollow, or I could stand as guardian to something older than greed. I spent 3 days forging conservation easements and environmental reports, learning the language of legal protection, building walls of paperwork around what mattered. When the developers returned, I met them with documents that made the land unbuildable, legally untouchable, permanently wild. Their anger meant nothing against the weight of what I'd chosen, the legacy I'd finally understood. That night, the family emerged together under the full moon, and the father placed his massive hand briefly against the pendant I wore openly now, a coronation more binding than any human ceremony could ever be. The seasons turned differently now, measured not by calendar months, but by the rhythms of the forest and the silent acknowledgements exchanged across the clearing. I've learned their patterns, when they harvest the high mountain berries, when they move to lower ground before storms I can't yet smell coming, when the young ones practice their calls in the pre-dawn darkness. My grandfather's journal has become my own, filled with observations and sketches, a chronicle of trust that spans generations. Sometimes I find pages he left blank, as if he always knew someone would need space to continue the story. The father comes closest now, occasionally leaving kills at the forest edge when winter runs harsh, an exchange of care that humbles me beyond words. The youngest, fully healed, watches me with curiosity rather than fear. And once I found tiny handprints pressed into the mud near my garden, a child's exploration, permitted because I've proven myself worthy of their vulnerability. These moments arrive like sacraments, small confirmations that I've been woven into something ancient and purposeful. I understand now why my grandfather never spoke of this, why he let everyone believe he was just an eccentric hermit with a worthless mountain plot. Some truths are too sacred for casual telling, some responsibilities too profound for those who haven't stood in the moonlight and felt the weight of intelligent eyes measuring your soul. This land chose us as much as we chose it, and that choosing demands everything, your silence, your sacrifice, your life. When I'm gone, I'll leave this journal and this pendant for whoever comes next, hoping they'll hear the question beneath the inheritance and answer it as we did, becoming guardian rather than owner, protector rather than master, continuing the unbroken lineage of those who stand between the ancient world and the one that would destroy it without ever knowing what it lost. Would you accept this burden if it found you? Subscribe to walk deeper into the unknown.